My name is Bob Genheimer. I am the George Rieveschl Curator of Archaeology at the Cincinnati Museum Center, and you are listening to the Woodhenge podcast.
Welcome to episode 13 of the Woodhenge podcast. I'm Mr. DeSanctis.
And I'm Miss Frederick.
And this episode's a little different.
It's so cool.
This one's cool. This has been fun. This has been one that we have talked about since August. As we kind of embarked on this journey, and the name is unique, and we knew it was unique. And if you do some research on it, you'll find some stuff. But we found a guy who knows more than some stuff.
Yeah.
And we're going to chat with him just here in a couple minutes.
Woodhenges. Stonehenges.
Woodhenge and Stonehenge, it's its own deal. And I think now is probably a good time to start the conversation about why this has been what it's been. We've done 12 episodes. We've talked to so many cool people. I still talk to Miss Sanders about all the weird jobs she's had. Harleman had some fun things that we talked to him about. Mason being the little home chef that he is.
A lot of our students just being wonderful people and prepping for different aspects of their lives.
Whether they're coming in from different states or different countries. We've gotten some awesome stories. And it started with an idea to essentially unearth the different things that are in this building. It was a conversation that happened some last year, and then kind of said, hey, let's just do it and see what happens. And as we're trying to figure out a name, I do have to give some credit to Mr. Barnhart, who helped kind of craft that idea of the Woodhenge, because I think some people had known about it. I think a lot of people didn't. But if you knew, you knew. And if you listen to this episode today, you're going to know.
Oh, yeah. I'll just preface with this because I kind of say it while we're interviewing our awesome interviewee, Bob. But a lot of people who go to Little Miami, who went to Little Miami, who even teach there, knew a rumor or thought it was like a ghost story, if you will, that Little Miami was Little Miami was built on top of a Native American burial ground, and honestly, learned it's not actually far off at all. Which is so cool to actually learn about after being from here and then teaching here and then, hearing that ghost story. So when you approached me and you said, oh yeah, it's called Woodhenge, I was like, wait a second, like those things that everybody's been joking about for, I don't know, the past 20, 30 years, that's real. And you were like, yeah, but now we have an expert who's going to actually talk to us about the meaning behind our podcast with a more historical context. So
it's a very historical.
It's
a very historical context. So in the same way that the Woodhenge underneath the football stadium was unearthed, you and I are digging into the stories of the building, whether it's students or staff. And I know we still have some people we want to talk to. I still think there's some low hanging fruit out there as we've been able to pull in, and we're in this home stretch before Christmas break. I think we still have a couple left in us before we break, and second semester schedules are a little different, so we'll kind of juggle that and see what we can do. But we wanted to make sure to get this in, to get this out. And I think this is something that's going to get sent around. I think this one, the distribution on this one for me, I think is a little different just because of everything that we talked about and everything that our guest had to tell us. Because like you, I've heard a lot of the rumors, and I dug in to research it. And there wasn't a lot outside of really academic papers. And if you've been in my room or had more than a conversation with me, I'm not a very academic person. So I don't call that light reading. I just call that no reading. I'm here for the pictures, and there's not really pictures of it. So our guest today is Bob Genheimer, who he's going to talk to us a little bit about his story. But I think the biggest background that's most relevant here is that he is one of the ones who was not one of the ones. He was the lead guy in uncovering the stuff that is under the ground where our high school sits now and our region coming down from Fort Ancient down towards Cincinnati, as well as the stuff in Cincinnati. I got to give a quick shout out to some of the folks at Fort Ancient who were super, super helpful.
Yeah.
This is something we've been working on for a couple of weeks, trying to get in touch with somebody and find somebody.
An expert.
Find an
seriously
expert on
wild.
And the folks at Ohio History Connection were great. Get me set up with Bob. He was awesome. He was great to get things set up with, and he has some awesome insight. So I don't know that there's anything more that you and I can say to preface this, other than like this was really cool.
Yeah, it was beyond enlightening, and it just again goes to show, I don't know, how important just education is. Continually being a learner, like. I felt that way, at least. I felt like I was sitting in my freshman lecture class or something, or in, Mr. Skidmore's class, listening to a lecture and being like, wow, it's new, it's cool. And that's how I felt when Bob was talking. I just was enraptured.
I was taking notes.
I know.
Like, I don't know what.
I was putting on my phone. I was like, okay, I'm going to look this up and look this up. Yes. I can't wait to do like a deep dive tonight.
Yeah,
or some taco soup.
Little post eval here of like everything that he gave us. I think it's truly fascinating. I mean, I'm a bit of a history nerd anyway. So to be able to dive into this is super, super cool. Yeah. So again, I don't know if there's anything more we can really say to preface this. Here comes episode 13. Bob Genheimer, an archaeologist, good dude. And a fan of our podcast name, apparently.
Yeah, apparently, and a really great speaker.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. So, without further ado, here's episode 13. Bob Genheimer, you're listening to the Woodhenge Podcast. Sweet. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us. Bob, how did you get into all of this? How did you get into kind of the research and stuff of like, I guess the archaeology? How did that start off for you?
When I was a child, I knew I was always interested in the past. I used to walk through the woods and see old foundations, and I'd collect old bottles, take them home. My mother would throw them out, and I'd bring more back. And it was sort of a game with me when I was a child. I was like, I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know it was an archaeologist, but it was like I was the only one who could interpret these things. So I was special. You know that when you're a child, when you feel special, that's a really cool thing. So when I got to the University of Cincinnati, again, I knew I was interested in the past. So I took intro courses to history and to anthropology, where archaeology is taught. And I've always told people I don't remember the history courses, but I do remember the archaeology stuff. And it was that point that I realized what I really wanted to do was get my hands dirty and work outside, and that's how it all got started.
Oh God, that's so cool. Oh my goodness. Is there a specific project that really, I guess, created your foundation for, I don't know, deeply loving this kind of like historical aspect of unearthing things?
Yeah, I would say that one of my first loves was what we call historical archaeology. And that's like, it's also referred to the archaeology of us. When you're doing the pre-contact stuff or the prehistoric stuff, as it's sometimes called, it's that's Native Americans. I'm not an indigenous person, but I think when you wed history with archaeology, it's a lot cooler. So I have done some major projects in downtown Cincinnati, for instance, excavating 19th century outhouse shafts that contain these like sealed, stratified records of the people who lived there, what they threw away. And the cool thing about this is you can look it up as opposed to archaeology of the Native American stuff. You can go to books and references, look this stuff up because people collect these things. So if I have a bottle that's embossed, I can find out when it was made. I can go to city directories. I can look at census stuff. So the historical archaeology to me has always been my first love. Now, I don't get to do it that often. I've spent most of my time doing the pre-contact Native American stuff.
So one of the big things here at Little Miami just is the tie-in with some of the ancient cultures that were here. I know a lot's been made of like the Hopewell people. We want to specifically ask you about the Woodhenge stuff, but what can you tell us kind of about the people that roamed this land and that were in this region long before we ever set foot here?
Well, the Hopewell, it's not a tribal name. It's just a culture that archaeologists have come up with. It's actually named for a white person who lived near Chillicothe. So it's not an indigenous term, but it's the sort of term that we have, and that's what we are using. So this area here that you're in Warren County is sort of an odd stretch of the river there, the Little Miami River. It's going east-west, and past that to the north and the south, it's going in a north-south direction. You're in an east-west. It has these enormous of um, deposits of Illinois and Wisconsin glacial material, which forms those big, broad, flat terraces on which your high school is sitting on. Those are the kind of places that these earthworks were placed onto. So Stubbs Earthworks was known very early. It was mapped by Charles Whittlesey in 1839. Although, if you look at his map, and I'm sure you guys have seen one, it is sort of an open square and an open circle tied together, a very large, what we call geometric earthwork. But his other landform features and so forth suggest that it's not totally accurate to what the actual landscape is. In fact, he admits doing it during a snowstorm, surveying it during a snowstorm. So it has some, it's not perfect, but it gives us an idea what's there. Unfortunately, it was never touched professionally until about 130 years later in like 1970, when I and some other archaeologists got involved with it. We were trying to record sites before they were destroyed. And when we got there, there was no high school. It was just all open fields. In fact, the area to the north of Montgomery Road or 22 was also not, it wasn't gravelled away yet. So it was a totally different place. And you could walk those fields and they were absolutely full of stuff that dates to the Hopewell period, including exotic raw materials like flint from Indiana, flint from east of Columbus, obsidian from Yellowstone National Park.
Wow.
We have flint from Wyoming. There's copper from Lake Superior. So a lot of stuff was being brought down to these sites, and there are a number of these earthwork sites. This one's called a geometric earthwork. There's one, the big one down in Hamilton County near Cincinnati. Obviously, you guys know just right up the river from you is Fort Ancient, which is another earthwork. It's not a geometric one, but it's a hilltop enclosure. So these are all over the place. The biggest ones and the best ones you can find are in the Chillicothe area on the Scioto River. So you can look those up and see those. But by the time we got there, there was nothing visible left of the earthwork, but there were mounds there. The area right about where your high school main building is situated, there was a large effigy mound there. Underneath that, there's also a remnant of a mound still there, I believe, in a drive at the northwest side of the high school. And the Woodhenge, which you guys talk about, and which is the name of your podcast, was situated about where the stadium is to the south of the high school. So if you can plot them up, now that one actually shows on Whittlesey's map as a big circle, but it had an opening. It was more like a C. What is referred to as a Woodhenge, or a post circle, some people call it. It's also referred to as the Stubbs Great Post Circle. It's one of the biggest ones in the U.S. It is bigger than the Moorhead Circle, which is up at Fort Ancient. So it had, how many posts did this had? It had a bunch of them, 172 large posts, telephone pole size posts, going around in a perfect circle. That was 73 meters in diameter, which is 240 feet. So almost, getting close to the length of the football field. So it took days and days and days to expose those posts with a backhoe going around. And some people had suggested, well, you were just kind of making this up. But you can't, if I asked you to form a circle on the ground that was 240 foot wide, you couldn't do it. It wouldn't look like a circle. Your brain doesn't work that way. So this thing was exposed, and we got radiocarbon dates out of it. So the dates tend to look like it's the end of the 2nd century into the 3rd century AD. So 1800 years ago,
Oh my
that,
gosh.
that stuff was there. Now, the whole Hopewell period is only about 300 to 400 years around that time. So we know it all has to date to that time period. Lots of other houses were found there as well. So when I say houses, we're looking at the footprints of the houses. So they have wooden posts in the ground, and those posts will leave a remnant. So there'll be a circle with darker soil in it, and you can scrape down the soil and you can map them out, and you can see the patterns. So there are circular houses, there are rectangular houses, square houses, crescent-shaped structures. Most of them appear to be temporary, as if they were temporary housing for people visiting there or craftspeople making things. They don't look really, really permanent. And the Hopewell folks were not agriculturalists. They didn't have maize, or at least not any maize in any sense that would allow them to subsist pretty much on that. So they're hunters and gatherers, fishermen, people, things like that. So although they were starting to um, affect the evolution and change of certain plants, mostly starchy and oily seeds, which we don't eat today, but they did back then. So they were starting to learn how you can actually modify these plants so you get bigger seeds or bigger things, and they would plant those as well. So it's very interesting stuff. We spent years there, beginning in the 70s, all the way up through 2003, maybe 2004. Right
Wow.
before, we were there right before the dozers came in to construct the high school. We actually got them to give us a couple extra weeks, if I remember, when it was constructed. So, yeah, it's a really cool site. Um, we had a lot of fun doing it, and all that exotic raw material is pretty neat to see.
Is everything pretty much as it was left? You guys were able to expose it, grab some samples, and then did it basically just get covered back up and they started putting the building together?
Well, some of the areas weren't impacted, but areas like where the building are, yes, anything there would have been destroyed. I doubt whether there's anything left of the Woodhenge, although those posts did go very, very deep. But there are other things to the east of you before the landform starts to slope back up a little bit there. There was a lot of houses over there, and I'm not really sure what's there today, what has happened to that. Yeah. Also, stuff extends across Cazadale Road to the west. It was on the uplands overlooking the valley there, where there's now a subdivision that goes up on top of that hill there. In fact, the Ohio History Connection in Columbus did they had commissioned an artist to do 4 paintings that represented Native Americans, and the one for Hopewell was actually the viewpoint is from that top of that hill overlooking Stubbs. And in the distance, you can see the earthworks. That's where your high school essentially is today.
Wow.
And if you look, if the book is called Ohio Archaeology, it was done by Brad Leopard, Ohio History Connection. If you can get a copy, and you might have a copy in your library, you should, because it has that image which looks right down to where your high school is today.
That is so cool. Um, do we know what the Woodhenges were for?
Um, we don't know precisely what they're used for. We know that they're not enclosed. They're certainly not roofed. Nobody's going to roof something 230 foot in diameter without any
Right.
other posts in between. We think that many of these things are, like the earthworks and so forth, they are sacred areas, and it's like walking into the doors of a church. When you walk in, you're on sacred ground. So if you go into this circle, there are probably some ceremonies, so forth. So ethnographically, or I should say ethnohistorically in the U.S., there are there are a couple places where you've seen these post circles being used for ceremonies and things. And so they're fairly common. Although this one at Stubbs is really big. There's only one that I know of. There's one at Cahokia, I believe, is bigger, and right in in Illinois, just opposite St. Louis. There's one there. I think that one's a little bigger, but they tend to be a little smaller. But this one is really, really big. And I wish I could tell you exactly what goes on there, but you don't. One of the things about these sites is they're relatively clean, except for what's in the plow zone. A lot of the material we got was what we call in the plow zone, that upper 10 inches or a foot where it's churned up. Below that, mostly we have just these posts. So they are relatively clean things. Now, there was another site to the east of you on that landform that goes up that produced a lot of obsidian and crystal quartz. In fact, there was caches of clear crystal quartz and obsidian up there as well. So these were obviously very important sites, these Hopewell folks. And they probably represent communities in the whole central part of the Little Miami River. And they're almost certainly related to what's going on at Fort Ancient and down at the Turner Earthworks in Cincinnati as well. Yeah, it's really, we're seeing, I don't know what you guys actually show about it up at the high school. I don't think I've ever been in the school, but you clearly should have something to show what was there.
Well, if you ever decide to make a trip up, we would be more than happy to host you and show you around, though it obviously is going to look significantly different than it did the last time. The last time you were here, because it's something that I've heard people talk about, but I think you're the first person we've been able to talk to that goes like, yes, this is a thing. I saw a couple of little articles online, but we really haven't been able to have anybody kind of dive into it at all, let alone to the level that you have. But I imagine that's what happens when you're kind of the one who started to dig all this up. So what is it like for you now to know that this stuff is here, but they're kind of building anyway?
Well, I mean, we can't stop progress. We can't stop things from happening. Luckily, we got in time to salvage a lot of what was there, and some of that was just serendipity. Just like actually the finding of that Woodhenge was serendipity. They had a backhoe that they were using. They had dug a transect about 10 foot wide by 150 feet, but they didn't intersect it. And they were going to send the backhoe operator home for the day. And one of them says, well, let's just let him go over here. And he did one more. And all of a sudden he hit one big post and another and another. And they realized that it was in an arc. And then for the next 5 days, they were digging those posts, taking samples and so forth. It was pretty much amazing. If they'd have been over another 2 feet, they never would have seen it in the first place. never would have saw it because the high school was going to be built within the next month. So,
oh my gosh.
Sometimes it's just dumb luck. Doesn't matter how much remote sensing you do or what else. Sometimes it's just luck. So, yeah.
So it was like, so you guys knew there was stuff here, but didn't know it to that extent. And this is just kind of an accident that we've gotten to the point we're at now.
Yeah, to find that Woodhenge. Now, the rest of it we knew was there. There's also something to on the other side of 22, down to the west a bit. There was another earthwork as part of this complex. It looks like a W on Whittlesey's 1839 map. And then years later, into the 20th century, it became known as the Warren County Serpent Mound.
Yeah.
And you can look it up, but if you look at some of the original drawings and stuff, and you compare, there are some aerials of it before it was gravelled away. We pretty much think that it was modified to look like a serpent by those who wanted it to be a serpent. But if you look in the literature, it's like, new serpent mound in Ohio, and another one, next one will be no new serpent mound in Ohio. So it's who you want to believe, but the short answer to that is it's gone. That was gravelled away, I believe, in the 40s, early 50s, somewhere in there. So it's completely gone. These sites also extend on the other side of the river, near South Lebanon as well. Those big bottoms down there, those hopeful sites are down there. We don't have any evidence of mounds or earthworks in there, but the sites with this exotic raw material are still down there as well.
For those who don't know what earthworks is, like, could you describe what it is for those who are like just now listening and haven't looked into this like Nick and I have, like psychopaths?
Earthworks are essentially just what they say. They're mounding up earth into form. So a mound is actually an earthwork. We usually use the word earthwork to refer to something that's geometric or linear or follows the edge of a slope, something like that. It's more akin to a berm or a wall. So if you go up to Fort Ancient, those embankment walls that you see, embankment's another good word if you want to use that. Those walls, some of those are large, so that was soil that was just mounted up over a long time to produce that. And what they're doing is enclosing the space. And I think there's 80 something gateways at Fort Ancient as well. There are ponds that were built there. So they're controlling for not just soil, but water as well. So they're really complex, and it really goes to the genius of these folks. They understood astronomy, they understood math, they understood all this sort of stuff that we would think, oh, they didn't know those things, but they did. These are people who knew the moon and the stars and the sun really well, particularly the moon. The lunar cycle is only 18.6 years. They knew that cycle. They knew where it moved back and forth. And there are earthworks such up at Newark, Ohio, where that moonrise every 18.6 years will line up through this geometric earthwork. So they understood astronomy really well. And what they were doing was essentially building their cosmos on the ground. And you could view it from higher points. These guys were pretty bright, and it's taken us forever to learn just how bright these indigenous folks were.
So
That's so cool.
The one that we've mainly been talking about here, right in our region, it's old, really, really old. Do we know where they went when they kind of vacated, or why? I was at Mesa Verde this summer, and they kind of said, yeah, they just pieced out, and we're still figuring it out. Do we know anything about what happened after that point?
Well, the Hopewell stuff itself sort of ends, and by that I mean the construction of the large earthworks and the exotic raw materials, that sort of trade network. But the people stay, and we have later sites, and that's referred to as the woodland period. After them is the late woodland, and they start really experimenting with plants. They start living in what we may call villages or clusters of houses. And by 1000 AD or 1100 AD, we have fairly sizable agricultural villages all over the Midwest. So when maize came up here out of the Southwest or from Mesoamerica, the maize gave them the ability to stay in one place for much of the year. They still hunted and fished and gathered. But if they had a good crop of corn, they could live together in larger groups. And that came with its own issues. When you live together, you have to learn how to get along with each other. Then you have disease is more of an issue. So, they had to cope with a lot of things. And they were all still here when Europeans arrived. They were here, and there were conflicts, and eventually they were moved out. It's not a pretty history in Ohio on the removal of indigenous folks. Some of them left. They saw the writing on the wall. Some of them tried to stay. It wasn't successful. Some of them were forcibly removed, like the Miami, who were actually marched through Ohio and put on a steamboat in Cincinnati and sent to Kansas. So it's not a pretty part of American history. They were pretty much moved out. So today we deal with them all the time. We have 18 indigenous partners at the Cincinnati Museum Center. That includes all three Shawnee tribes, the Miami, a whole bunch of others. And we talk to them about everything, about where their ancestors are going back, about exhibit work, all sorts of things. So it's a whole new world than when I started doing archaeology back in the 1970s.
So you mentioned the Cincinnati Museum Center. I know that's where you are now. Can you give us just a little bit of insight as to what your role there is and what you do there with them?
Sure. My title is the George Rieveschl Curator of Archaeology. And if you're wondering who George Rieveschl is, he invented Benadryl. And he endowed the curatorial position here. He was a fan of archaeology, among other things. So I oversee another employee who's a collection manager, and he is a tribal liaison person. He does our NAGPR work, and NAGPR is Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That's where we are working with our tribal partners. We have lots of interns and volunteers, so we're working on an exhibit that's going to open maybe in 2026. In the museum world, it takes 3 or 4 years and lots of money to build new exhibits. So it's going to be an Indigenous Peoples Gallery. That's not going to be its title, but that's our working title at the moment. So sometimes I write papers, do all sorts of other stuff. I give a lot of talks. So yeah, I mean, it's quite fun. I've been there 34 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been a long time.
Goodness, I love that.
This has been invaluable.
Wow. It's so crazy. So I grew up here. I went to Little Miami, and then I actually had the pleasure of coming back and teaching. And so when I was, we grew up hearing spooky stories about, like, I don't know, like superstitious stories about, like, the school being built on a Native American spiritual ground. But I always thought it was a bunch of hogwash. And now, like, it's real.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just like mind blowing to me. Like, honestly, so cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure. I would encourage you to look up Stubbs Earthworks online, or look up the name Frank Callan. He did a lot of the work with us as well. A lot of this stuff is under his name, COWAN. And you will find maps of the earthwork. The Whittlesey map is pretty easy to find, the 1839 map. And and it has the road on it. So it has 22 on it. Now, whether it's in the exact same position, I don't know. It's just like a trace where the road is. So it'll give you an idea where that earthwork actually is. A lot of it was north of 22, but a lot of it was south as well, where the high school is. So, but I think it's good for people to know that the land that they're on, the land that you're teaching on, was once native land and also sacred land to them.
I love that. Yeah, I would love to share that more with our students. It would be interesting if you came and visited, just because, like Nick was saying, like, it's very different, but also I think a lot of that historical background that you gave, and digging up and unearthing all that information, it's really not embedded in our school's history. It's clearly just shown as a ghost story. So I think that you coming on this podcast, it helps tremendously with educating all of our community members and all of our students too. I love that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Sure. Well, invite me sometime and I'll come up.
Yeah.
It's a standing invite, my man. Whenever you feel like making the trek on out, Lauren and I can make ourselves available. We have to get set to go teach the next generation. But seriously, I really appreciate you hopping on with us and taking some time out of your day to enlighten us on this stuff. This has been super, super cool.
This is awesome.
My pleasure. Thank you.